This is the Augusto Digital Insights Podcast, and I'm your host, Brian Anderson. Here we talk to industry leaders about how they're using digital technology to transform their businesses. There's a lot to cover here, so let's get started.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Augusto Digital Product Insights Podcast. This is episode number 3. Our guest is Michael Sacca. Michael is the founder of Rocket Ship FM, the very popular digital product management podcast, also the VP of product at Dribbble, and founder of other agencies and products, and a guru in this space. Welcome, Michael Sacca.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. Yeah.
Hey, Michael, why don't you just start by just giving us some of your story around the journey you went through into digital products.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it starts a while ago, 15, maybe 20 years ago. But I was working in a restaurant. I really wasn't enjoying what I was doing. I got to LA to work in the music business. I could never find a job after 3 years in the music business. And so I had a roommate at the time who was coding PHP. He taught himself PHP, and he was working for this small company, and he had built some digital software for them, so that they couldn't really get rid of him. He was the only one that knew how to run it, and like half the business was running on the software. So he would wake up around noon, he'd come home around 4, and he was making 3 times as much money as I was. So I saw an opportunity here to start to work in this space. And so he had a lot of freelance clients, and so I started to take on his overflow work in order to teach myself, the basics of front end and back end code, as well as design. And design was really where I had the most kind of natural inclination. So over the next 5 or so years, I lived off freelance work, and I built up a small agency. And we ended up working for clients like Kobe Bryant. We did KB24.com or parts of it. We did working with Scholastic, with G. And so that was kind of my foray into tech. And eventually we had a physical office in San Diego, which we ran for about another 5 years. So that's where I learned a lot of product management, but then also a lot of sales, a lot of partnerships, and all the other aspects that come with running an agency, right? You get into an agency to sometimes do the creative work. But when you're in the agency, you realize, I got to keep this on too. So I was really able to get a kind of a holistic view, which is exactly what a product manager needs anyway. And so today I work as the VP of product at Dribbble.
That's awesome. Yeah, so you started out really doing development work and engineering work. Mm-hmm. You acquired all this broader set of knowledge. Maybe tell a little bit of the story of how you got the Dribbble. Like, I know there's an interesting background.
Yeah, so I came to a point with running the agency where I looked for something new. We had been building products internally, and I'd say to kind of get the itch to wake up and build the same thing every day. And so we had built this product, we had built some language learning apps for kids, and that was the part of the job that I enjoyed the most, was continuing to iterate on those, getting feedback and data from customers, and then building the next versions, because we were learning, right? And so I wanted to do more of that work. So eventually I stepped away from the agency and I went to work at Crew. Crew's CEO, Michael, had reached out and he said, I want you to run our partnerships. I had never run partnerships for anything, but I was like, all right, I could do sales. So let me try the partnership. So I joined Crew. I ended up working on some of their experimental products that we were trying to put out. Referral systems for agencies. Crew was a freelance marketplace. We worked with small agencies and freelancers to match them with projects. So essentially we were a productized agency, right? With just no dev staff. And so people were coming to Crew to build their website, to build their applications, and then we were matching them up with teams behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And so it really was an extension of the agency. It was just a different way to look at it. And so I really enjoyed that. I got to work and build a couple of our like experimental product systems. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. The big one was the referral system. agencies, larger agencies, could work with us to basically hand off their referrals, and we would manage a 10% referral commission on that project. So when they submitted a project into our system, we would match it with a smaller agency who could do the work, and then we would take off 10%, break off 10% and give it back to the agency, which is something that happens organically in the agency world. We just try to give it a more formalized process. And so as Crew developed Unsplash as a side project to get attention for itself. But Unsplash turned into this beast, and right now it's a top 300 website in the world in terms of traffic. And so the founders and the board decided this is where our big opportunity is in Unsplash, and they're right. It was growing despite us even trying. And so we took a bunch of the team. The founders started to shift their attention over to Unsplash, and then we still had this asset of Crew. And so we decided to sell it. And so I did the roadshow, and we ended up with being acquired by Dribbble. Dribbble being one of the biggest marketplaces for design talent. It's also the place where people show off their creative work, and we have portfolios for the top designers in the world that are active on Dribbble, right? It's the social portfolio network. And so it was such a great fit for kind of the Crew mission. So we were acquired almost 3 years ago now, today. And slowly, I ran our sales team. I started our sales team at Dribbble. I ran early version for marketing, our data team, and now I run the product. And it really is that holistic insight into the business that I think helps create a great product leader.
That's great. That's an interesting story. When you hear people talk about the product mindset, what comes to mind for you? What do you think the product mindset is?
So I think it's really about solving the problems of the business at the time, right? And it's solving those through software. And so I think traditionally businesses have solved those problems through marketing and through sales, right? If we look back 20, 30 years. But today, more and more people are solving their business problems through product itself. And so the product has really become the focal point of the company, where marketing has to go through product in order to get initiatives approved. Sales has to go through product to get new features, right? Support goes through product to get their problem solved. So it really has become the focal point of a company, and really the focal point of the company's revenue generation. And so for me, having a product mindset is really looking at solving business problems through the lens of software.
That's interesting. Yeah. What do you think? When I spoke to Rich and Mike Belsito, they had talked a little bit about hypothesis and really like validating those hypotheses, understanding your customers. What are your thoughts on those topics? Yeah, no, and I think it's all part of the product experience, right? But I think sometimes with product, we do get too narrow into the customer. The customer is incredibly important. I also think the business is important as well. We don't talk enough about that. So customer validation, being the voice of the customer is incredibly important, but it's not everything. And so if those are tools to solve business problems, at least in my world, in my definition. Right. Because you gotta have a growing business. It's gotta add value, but it also has to produce for the people that are running the business and the shareholders of the business. Right? Exactly. Yeah. You have to everyone has a seat at the table. The customer has a seat, your board has a seat, your CEO has a seat, right? They all have a seat, but then also your marketing team and your sales team, those are all your customers you do have to keep happy. If your sales team is unhappy, the business will fail, and ultimately your customers will go somewhere else, right? So it's all related, and really what the product team, leader's job is to balance these needs and to solve the problems in an elegant way that work for these different stakeholders, the customer being one. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense, kind of broadening that. One of the other questions I've got is when you're in a working relationship between product management and product engineering and design, I'm trying to explore that layer of relationship.
Sure.
What is your opinion about like the best way that is organized, and some good stories about that?
Yeah, so it's a tough relationship because no one reports to anyone, right? We're all peers. And so one of the things that we try to do at Dribbble, and this is hard, I actually learned this from Envision, was getting consensus, right? So if you look at that as an equal layer across product, design, engineering, right? On every project you have leads that have opinions on the direction that we should go. Some organizations say, look, the product manager is the owner, whatever they say goes, right? But that doesn't create consensus across the board. And to really build a great product, you need design bought in, you need engineering bought in. So the methodology that I prefer is to actually put pressure on the product manager to then create consensus across the board, which means they have to have those tough conversations. They have to come out of it saying, agree in the direction we're moving forward. And they don't have to agree on every aspect of it. And someone, just like on the Supreme Court can say, I don't agree with this direction, but I'm at least willing to go, right? Mm-hmm. We all need to be willing to move forward. So for me, it really is, it's a of equal minds there. And I think the ideal scenario is to get everyone on the same page and to be moving forward in unison, and not necessarily dictatorship there, because no one reports to anyone, right? And so you have a lack of that authoritative hierarchy, which does make things go faster, but I don't know if it makes things better. And so that's something that we've been pushing at Dribbble is to really create consensus across the product team so that everyone is in agreement in the direction that we're going, and the direction isn't necessarily just dictated from above.
Yeah, how do you define the product team? Who are the players in the product team?
Yeah, so what we have, we use a pod system. And so every 6 weeks we switch up our focus, and it allows us to resource accordingly to what our goals are, what our major initiatives are. So we have a PM, we have a design, we have front end and back end engineering. So that makes up our pod. And then as consultants, we have leadership and we have data. And so those are our resources that the team can tap into it in whenever they have questions, either about the strategy and direction or about, what have we seen on site, right? Too many times we make decisions and about how we use something, which is the worst way to do it. We've had millions and millions of users. So no one use case ever satisfied. Yeah. And so that's why we have data as a consultant to make sure that when we're making those decisions, we have actual backup to our decision.
Yeah, that's interesting. How does that data get accrued? How does it get collected? Who's involved in that process?
Yeah, so we have an infrastructure engineering team. So they're in charge of basically collecting all the data. We use a router, which is very similar to Segment. So that basically in the product, we're able to define every touch point that we want to collect. That could be a page view, it could be a button click. All of that is then stored in our data lake, and our data team, we use Mode. And so we're able to pull out insights from Mode and build dashboards of whatever question we're looking to answer. And so we've got like the standard dashboards, the standard reporting dashboards. But then also we're able to do kind of ad hoc SQL queries against that data to see, well, how many users came in from this landing page, clicked on this button, converted, right? And we can build out those conversion funnels. We can look at feature usage, really anything that you can imagine. But yeah, so our data team is in charge of collecting and storing that and then analyzing it when the product team has questions.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you ever go validate any of that with the customer through interviews or is it mostly build something small, get it launched, and then test it? What are the preferred techniques? Yeah,
so it's a great question, and this varies a bit on the company size. So we did have a UX team at one point about a year ago, and they were going out and doing customer interviews, which was really helpful to kind of humanize what we were seeing in the data. With Dribbble, we're a top 700 site in the world. And so there's millions of people visiting. One of the challenges that we found, being a small team, I should say, right? If we were bigger, I think we still would have this UX research component. But what we found is with, having one researcher and having 3 distinct business lines, it was really hard to keep up with the research and get the research to move as fast as our data could. And also our research, you interview 10 people, you interview 20 people out of 1 million. We were missing a lot. We were missing a lot of that gap. So we did do some customer interviews for some key initiatives. We still do that today when we're just not sure, like we're seeing different things in the data. We just don't know what's happening. We will go out and I'll either do survey data, which is very effective for us. So sending out a survey to a couple thousand people is fairly easy. And if we really, really want to know more on the emotional side of like, how are people feeling when they use it, then we'll do the in-person interviews. But most of our decisions are made on kind of aggregate data for site usage, because we're able to see the different use cases and really see, okay, 80% of the people are doing this, 20% of the people are doing this. If we were just interviewing people, sometimes we miss that volume and we don't appreciate what we overemphasize for that one person's user experience. And we don't always appreciate that. Well, there's actually 10,000 people doing this and there's 200 doing this. Right. And so we have to make those product decisions based on both the volume of usage and then the kind of solution or the problem that we're trying to solve.
And my assumption is that when you get to the scale where you have millions of people and you've instituted the app to the level that you guys have, that is the right way to do it. Like, do you recommend doing that level of when you're smaller, when you're just building your initial user base? What do you recommend at smaller scale?
Yeah, so when I had Brandisty, right, and that is the great caveat, right? You can't do this if you're not at scale. And so when I had Brandisty, we had 100 people visiting our site in a week, right? And so that's when we just did customer interview after customer interview. We had people coming into our office to interview. We were bringing in local creative directors, and we were sitting down with them, watching them use the product. There's great tools like Hotjar, and I forget the other one, but we use Hotjar at Dribbble even. So you're able to site record people using either your landing page or your app. And those, I think it's the only way to really get data when you don't have large volume of people using your site is to do those customer interviews. And so before we launched Brandisty, over 150 user interviews that ranged from like beta testing to even just like concept testing, where we just kind of pitched them the idea, is this a problem that you would that you have, and we did that kind of jobs to be done problem validation work.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to ask about some of these frameworks like jobs to be done. I've also heard good things about the lean product or the lean startup playbook.
Sure.
Dan Olden's framework or books. And what's your thoughts on these frameworks? And like you mentioned the problem. Like I've also heard a lot about product managers need to be the people that are identifying problems.
Yes.
And then building consensus around the solution.
Yep. I think the frameworks are great. I think the hardest part is to know what framework to use. I don't believe that there's any one framework that solves all problems. And I don't even know if Bob Mesta would say jobs to be done solves all problems. It does solve, it does have a wide range of use cases. But yeah, so I think it's about learning some of the methodologies and picking out the tools that you need to actually get the answers that you're looking for. So I do love jobs to be done. I think it's one of the most powerful frameworks, and I think the power of it is changing the way that you think about a solution and think about the problem that you're trying to solve, right? We come from marketing. Marketing is where really product management started, was in branding and marketing. And so I think inherently built into some of our kind of vernacular is like the idea of personas and how we solve problems for them. But personas is really a marketing term, not necessarily a product term. And so when we start to flip that around with jobs to be done and you focus on anxieties and pain points, right? So now you're not looking at a person and what characteristics they embody. but now you're looking at people with a common pain point. And that's so much, just that methodology of thinking really helps you to attack a problem in a more meaningful way, rather than trying to solve a problem for 28 to 35-year-old women in the Chicago area who liked fitness, right? Instead, you could just focus on people who, are slightly out of shape and are motivated to live a healthier lifestyle, right?
Right.
And so that's a much wider swath of people than your personas will ever build. So, but I do think it's all about using the tools like the lean starter, like the lean product methodology is great in the early stages. I think it breaks at the later stages. And so where I find people go wrong is they try to take some of these methodologies that are perfect for an early stage startup, and then you try to apply it inside of a large healthcare organization. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right? Or sometimes it works to get initial product off the ground, but eventually you do need to integrate back into the organization's larger structure. And so that's going to require a different tool set in order to keep moving forward and making progress. We just did a case study with about Intuit, right? And at Intuit, Brian Crofts, who's now the CPO at Pendo, he was leading a startup focus inside of Intuit, and it was a mandate from the CEO. And he had built this product, he validated it, he was kind of using the lean methodology. They did 3 years of research and they were getting amazing results on it. But when he integrated back into the organization, he had the wrong set of tools in order to actually get the work approved. And so he succumbed to pressure from various departments to change his product, to go against his research, because he had organizational pressure. And at the time, he didn't have the skill set to overcome that. And so the product ended up failing. They spent like $5 million in ads and acquired like under 10 users, right? And so it ended up failing because the methodologies that got the product to market were not the same that were going to work internally. And the skill set that he needed to run a lean process and prove that out wasn't the same as getting internal buy-in and continued development of that product in a meaningful way. And so ultimately it failed. They relaunched it 3 years later using a different methodology, selling it internally, and it's now a huge success. And so I do think that all of these methodologies comes with up and downs, and right. It's really about knowing what you need at that moment, and being able to switch away from a methodology before it stops working.
Yeah, I that's interesting. Really similar feedback to others I've spoken to. And it's like there is a spectrum, and just figuring out the right times. Like you can. It definitely sounds like they're valuable. Like jobs done is a key way to think, right? Yep. And but when you start realizing that you're hitting those breaking points of struggle, fighting maybe like integrating some of these innovative ideas into a larger organization or something like that, then it's time. You have to recognize it's time to shift. Yep. And focus on different frameworks that are going to help you apply some of that into a bigger organization.
Yeah.
Or as you scale and your needs change, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting, going back to that whole product engineering, product design relationship, Sure. When's it been bad? When did you realize it was oh my gosh, this is not working?
Oh yeah. Lots of times. I think when it really goes wrong is when you're too top down. And so, there's a natural tendency in manufacturing to use a waterfall method, and that's really why this consensus is so important. So I've got this wrong so many times. We're trying to move really fast, and so you end up giving the PM full requirements. The PM breaks those down and gives the engineering full requirements and the design team full requirements, and they just feel like they're ticking tasks in whatever task management you're using. And so they don't feel bought to the solution. You also end up missing a lot of the nuance that only an engineer or design perspective will catch. We always design for the happy path. What about the sad path, right? What happens when a user does X, Y, and Z? If your team isn't bought into that and they're not invested in this solution, they're going to do what the spec says, but oftentimes the spec is missing the nuance that only they will be able to catch from their unique perspective. Mm-hmm. So I do think it's really important to make sure that you do have that the team does feel bought into the solution, but also part of the solution. Because when they're part of the solution, they'll actually solve the problems. And when they feel like they're just getting tasks, which is when I feel like it really goes wrong, is when you get kind of subpar output.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you there. What else? Like, are there any other ones you think of that come to mind?
I think that was the one that I see that I make a mistake of all the time. I think I don't know.
You ever have people want to just build stuff because they think it's cool?
Oh, well, yeah. Yeah, so...
Or like overemphasize design.
It's kind of the flip side. Yeah. And that's really where you do the consensus solves all of these problems. Yeah. It doesn't happen as often now. I think we have a more mature process. But yeah, working at smaller companies where people have even more autonomy, we like at Crew, we built a lot of stuff that didn't matter. So I told this story on one of the early rocket ship episodes of this season, but at Crew, there was two instances that kind of fit into this bucket. One, we sent our developers to a Cake PHP conference where they were announcing a new version of Cake PHP. We were on version 5 or something, and version 6 was hyped up at this conference. So they came back and they're like, we need to rebuild the app, Cake PHP 5 or 6. And we were like, fine, you're the director of engineering, do your thing. It ended up taking 6 months to upgrade the app to feature parity so that they could use some of the new features, right? And so we did 6 months without really building any new features because they were focused on converting all the old app over. And mind you, we weren't failing. We weren't hitting engineering roadblocks. We just didn't do the newest and coolest stuff with this framework, right? So we wasted 6 months where we didn't build anything of value upgrading the app. Then once we were upgraded, the design team was getting itchy, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're like, well, we want to redesign the app so it's a better experience for the user. So we spent another 6 months again redesigning the app to feature parity from what we currently have to solve some pain points of the customer, which we actually didn't solve. So we ended up just building something cool that looked cool, sliders coming in and out. But all we did was move people's toys around. And so they came back into the app, they had no idea where to find anything.
And you were gone.
And then, we lost a year of building actual productive and revenue generating features, one to engineering and one to design. And what we ended up with the exact same app with features in different places.
Right.
And so that was a huge lesson in balancing that, and not always having to stay on the cutting edge. Sometimes the cutting edge is a bit, it's exciting when you can be there, but you don't always have to be, especially when you're dealing with a huge platform.
Yeah, I've seen that before too, and definitely I think what you're talking about with consensus and like thinking about those outcomes, right? Like, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Like, we're trying to grow this, we're trying to grow our revenue, trying to grow our user base, trying to reduce costs or whatever those things are. And it's like, those things that are sexy or cool, like they often don't have a huge impact on your customer.
Yeah.
And people can make huge cases and people can buy into them that take a year, and it's like, well, we wasted time,
And so we found ourselves in a place where we had to sell the company, and we had just lost this year of productivity. So our like back end, we were pitching like, we could do all this automated stuff, but really it was just all manual. I remember being on pitch calls and having the co-founder like edit fields off screen so that it looked like they're happening. And, ultimately in due diligence, as some of these companies dug into our back end at Crew, they were like, this is very manual. And so this isn't something that we can scale. I thought you guys had already built all of that, programmatic logic into this. And so ultimately they passed on us. And so it had a direct effect on the value of the company. Because if we had spent that year building out the automations, making this an easier use, we could have maybe had a different outcome. But it reduced the value of, not that we had a bad outcome, Dribbble is fantastic, but it did definitely reduce the value of the company in the end. So those decisions had a direct effect on our revenue.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Those are great insights. Hey, a couple more questions. One is, when you're sourcing product engineers or designers to work with you, I know some of them are going to be maybe employees, but like I imagine that there's a contractor network there or people or firms that you like to work with. Like, how does that process usually work for a mature product organization?
Oh, it's hard. It's still hard. So we're lucky that we manage a network of designers. So when we need a designer, we go to Dribbble. But even then, it's hard. So we always start with a really small project because you don't really know what is going to happen. We've worked with organizations that have amazing portfolios. I've worked with some of the biggest companies. You don't always know what team you're going to get, even at these large agencies, right? You might get the B team, you might get the C team. And their A team might be working with, Uber and Google, right? And that's the work that you see publicly. So we always start with a smaller contract just to get to know each other. We bring them into Slack, and that helps us test their communication skills, and then test the quality of the deliverable, and then we'll move on to larger initiatives. So it really is just building those relationships and the trust. I haven't found a service that does that perfectly yet. So it still is very much, you test them out, you see if you like them, and when you find someone that you like, it's harder than you think. And so when you find someone you like, you stick with them. And so we've built out a network that we trust, at least at Dribbble. And so that's nice. But when we do have skill sets that are outside of that network's capabilities, we have to start fresh again. We recently just did it, finding some illustrators for some of our marketing. And, we started with a 2-day project. To see how they would do it. And now we're moving into some of the bigger stuff. But some people pass and some people fail. You have to be okay to fail people and kind of cut the cord and move on. And when you find someone good, latch onto them and build that relationship.
Yeah. Is that usually a single person, or is that a firm? What's the mix there?
That depends on the size of the project. So we're right now exploring some larger projects, which include both the back end and front end development as well as design that we're looking for. So we're looking at full agencies for that, because agencies have you de-risk yourself when you go with an agency, even though maybe it costs a little bit more. You de-risk yourself because you're working with people who work together on projects all the time. And so that's what we use for larger scale. For smaller stuff like illustrations for the blog, we'll go with individuals. But it really depends on the project size. Once you get into a large project that you're talking longer than a month it's going to take to finish, I would generally go with an agency, because they've got the resources, the product, the built-in product management, the team that is already gelled and works really well together and has all that communication figured out. That's when I go with an agency, because you're really going to de-risk your investment.
One last question on that topic is, what's the best model for engaging a firm like that? Do you like a team over time? Do you try to fix them on a budget? What's your ideal approach for partnering with somebody like that?
It does depend on the project. I think, the best relationships are built on trust. And I think the fixed budgets are, even when I was running an agency, always where we started. I know more, that was a while ago. So I know more agencies are running kind of like a monthly retainer. And I think as long as you write the contract so that there is an out, and I think that out is really the responsibility on both sides, right? It's a responsibility of the agency to continue to drive, to deliver value. And it's the responsibility of the client to make sure that this relationship is functional. Clients fire, or agencies fire clients as well, right? If the client really isn't getting it or isn't is difficult to work with. So I think there needs to be an out. I do think that I don't know if there's one contract type that solves all. I know at Dribbble we're bootstrapped, and so we do a lot of cost control, and so we would generally prefer starting with a fixed budget. We want to know how much we're going to spend so that we can forecast. And so that helps to build trust with us is can we work within a budget? But I'm not opposed to kind of the subscription model as well on the recurring monthly, as long as it's not abusive in the contract.
Yeah, totally. That's great. Thanks for that. Hey, Michael, how do people stay connected with you and more about your endeavors?
Sure. Probably the best place to listen to the podcast, rocketship.fm. We do weekly shows all on product, and right now we're talking about product failures. So we've covered Google Plus and Color and Intuit and eBay. And then I'm on Twitter at Michael Sacca, and you can check out Dribbble at dribbble.com with 3 Bs, which is the most fantastic design communities out there.
Cool. Thanks, man. Appreciate all the insights and being on the show.
Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Augusto Digital Insights podcast. Augusto is a custom software design and development company. If we can help you on your next project, or you just want to say hello, contact me today by calling 616-427-1914 or visit www.augustodigital.com. Remember, you can always find this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube.